Hello, and welcome to an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast, where each week we deliver insights, trends, and news for shippers and carriers. Now, it's the week of January 10th. I'm Jenny Ruiz, and I'm joined by our market expert, Justin Mays. Mays, how is it going?
Hey, Jenny, it's great to be back with you again this week, as always. And things are going quite well, coming off the new year. But this week we're definitely in for, potential volatility throughout the country.
Yeah, let's get right into it. Now, winter weather is top of mind for us here, and I know that we'll get more into how last week's storms affected parts of the Midwest in our regional breakdown, but there are actually storms brewing across the country. We're looking at flooding rain, high winds with gusts of up to 70 miles per hour, which is wild, and even potential tornadoes. So, Mays, I have to ask you, how do you think that's going to affect freight this week, which feels like an unfair question?
No, it's definitely hard to tell. It's always tough to tell in these situations. We don't have that crystal ball. But when talking about weather events, especially one that we're experiencing right now from coast to coast, it's not just snowfall, like you said, it's tornadoes, it's strong wind. It can definitely have an impact on the trucking industry. Now, I don't think we're going to see any impact that we saw in 2021 with a deep freeze down in the south, where we really saw rates actually skyrocket back upward in one of the traditional slower months. But I think we're going to see some tightening happening up in the Northeast and the Midwest again. But, when we get into the regional breakdown, we'll see, what it's looking like over the next week.
All right. Well, last week we mentioned that we would touch on the affected South and Southeast rate increase surprises on last week's show. So anything of note here that we want to get into before we head into that regional breakdown?
Nothing really top of mind, Jenny. When we dove into the data, we really didn't see any outliers of why we saw such an impact through the holidays, specifically in the South and Southeast. Now, volume was higher in those regions than we would traditionally see the past few years, but nothing that really spells out why we saw that disruption. Ultimately, those are the regions where the rates were the lowest, so they did have the most room to go upward. But as we get into the regional breakdown, we'll see what unfolded over the last week.
All right. Well, let's start talking about where we closed the week out with our average national rate per mile, line haul only, and tender rejections across the country. Where do we land there?
Yeah, of course, Jenny. The national average has been pretty stubborn. From last Monday to this Monday, the national average line haul rate per mile has only decreased by about a penny. Now, it's a slow downward pressure that we are seeing, similar to 2021 rather than last year. But I do think that this week we're going to see the national average actually fall faster. That's even with the storms rolling across the country. I just think there's still a lot of room out there. We're actually seeing capacity already loosen up early this week. If I had to guess, I think we're going to, we left last Friday at $1.81 line haul rate per mile. I think by this Friday, especially as the storms pass and it gets looser through the week, we're going to probably fall around $1.73 per mile out of national average for the line hauls.
Okay, and what about tender rejections?
When we're talking about tender rejections, it was a different story. We fell right back to where we were in mid-December. I mean, we saw the surge from the holidays reach around 5.5%, but this week we're already down to just 4.17%. And again, that is where we were in mid-December. So, yeah, we saw tender rejections jump up, but they did quickly go back down. Just, again, really showing how loose capacity continues to remain as we entered 2024.
All right. Well, that said, you know what it's time for, the regional breakdown. Now, give us an overall view of where the market sat last week and what's on the horizon for this week.
Yeah, of course, Jenny. I think, again, we need to keep an eye on the Midwest and Northeast, especially as these storms roll across the country. These two regions are most likely going to continue to experience some tightening. Surprisingly, the coastal region also tightened quite a bit over the last week. That's really due to the markets that neighbor the Northeast that also experience some, winter weather. But if I was a betting man, I would have beat the house last week when I said that we're going to see the South and Southeast decrease the most, because that is where we saw the market soften as we anticipated.
Okay, yeah, let's get into it. I think we should start with the Midwest, since this is seemingly the area with the most volatility, as you mentioned. What are we looking at there? Any specific markets we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, Jenny, I think the entire Midwest is going to be poised for an increase. Now, it's going to be a favorable region for the drivers, but also, shout out to Michigan State for winning the national championship for college football. But it's going to be pretty widespread across the Midwest, for seeing pressure on the markets due to the snowstorm. They're being hit by back-to-back snowstorms, so we're going to continue to see some capacity issues. It's important for shippers and receivers to understand that they should anticipate drivers to be late and understand that there's a disruption that the snowstorm and storms across the country are going to have.
Yeah. And now what about the Northeast? I know that this is the region where we might see sort of the biggest change in rates and rejections. Where do we land here?
Yeah, we did see an increase in rates in the Northeast for freight originating there. But to be honest, the snowstorm that we were originally speaking about last week didn't have too much of an impact to the higher volume markets in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Now, that's not speaking for parts of like Massachusetts that did see over a foot of snow, but it didn't have as much of an impact as it could have had on the Northeast. This week, we're going to continue to see tightening. I know me and you were talking earlier about the potential widespread power outages up in the Northeast and severe flooding that could take place over Tuesday and Wednesday. So it's something to definitely keep an eye on.
And then again on Friday and Saturday potentially. So even if this doesn't, as by the time we put this up and this recording up, we may see some sort of damage, but there's also that potential for it to happen again. So there's no let up in the Northeast right now.
Nope.
Not fun for us. Why don't we move over to the coastal region? Now, I know that this is kind of ridiculous because we are seeing storms all across the country, but specifically here in this region, we're looking at coastal Texas and even a big impact to North Carolina. So what are we looking at in this region?
Yeah, we're still seeing an impact on rates leaving the coastal region. They are still rising, really following suit with the Northeast, especially the markets that are, again, neighboring the Northeast. This week, I think it's going to be a tale of two stories. I think we're going to continue to see North Carolina and South Carolina soften through the week because after today, the storm should be relatively past. But the same isn't going to be said for states like Maryland and Virginia that are probably going to continue to experience some tightening just due to capacity issues up in the Northeast.
Okay. What about the West Coast? Where are we looking at there? I feel like they're getting a little bit of a reprieve, but you tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're definitely right. I mean, it is a mixed story on the West Coast. Overall, the West Coast is definitely softening in favor of shippers with rates trending downward, especially in the largest volume markets. But there's plenty of snow to be found out on the West Coast as well. It's just the more rural areas, parts of Colorado, almost the entire state of Idaho, and, the mountain areas of California and the Pacific Northwest. But where freight is actually moving out of, we're seeing that downward pressure on rates. Now, at the end of the show, we're going to talk about what's coming next week on the horizon, and I think we're going to talk, about maritime and how that can change the scene on the West Coast in months to come.
Oh man, I knew that was going to be an issue. Now, last week we mentioned we would explore, I know we talked about it at the top of the show as well, unexpected volatility for the South and the Southeast. Anything on the culprit there? I know that we mentioned at the top of the show there really wasn't much to take note of, but what is this region seeing now with the storms happening throughout the country?
Yeah, definitely, Jenny. The Southeast in particular has really loosened up over the last week, especially the state of Florida. And Florida was one of those surprise states through the holidays that really tightened up, especially shorter lengths of haul. But definitely the opposite has happened over the past week. The largest markets by volume, such as Atlanta or Miami, have seen softening continue. And to be honest, Jenny, for the remainder of the month, we're going to see this region loosen up with rates declining. As for the South, it's a similar story to the Southeast, not as soft, but, last week we called out how rates in Laredo, Texas, skyrocketed. It was really bringing up that regional average, but over the past week, we've seen capacity soften out in Laredo, not just Laredo, but also higher volume markets such as Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. So again, I think it's going to be a similar story to what we are going to experience in the Southeast, where, where the weather is warmer, the market's going to continue to soften in favor of shippers.
Yeah. What about so as we look forward into the following week, or the week ahead, you're talking about maritime might be somewhat of an issue. Expand on that for me, because I'm hearing things about imports and right sizing, sort of or actually replenishing where shippers have right size. What are we looking at there?
Yeah, I think it's a tale of two stories, right? We talked about it last week, what's happening in the Red Sea.
Yeah.
Nothing's really changed. It's still an issue. If anything, it's gotten worse. And like you said, a lot of stories are coming out about right sizing inventory, potentially putting more orders in. Just looking back at what we experienced in December, it was a stronger, imports showed more strength than most anticipated for. And a lot of this was going to the West Coast. And the big thing is, if the Red Sea continues to be a choke point for maritime and the Panama Canal continues to have its problems, we could start seeing a lot more of that maritime freight of imports in the U.S. shift back to the West Coast. Ultimately, that's going to lead to, more freight for longer lengths of haul. It's going to definitely push more freight into rail, intermodal, but also more truckload freight for longer lengths of haul, which ultimately eats up capacity and really drives up the average market rate. Again, this is something that could come in the months. It's not next week or the week after that. And the factors have to persist. The issues in the Red Sea, the issues with the Panama Canal. And if these stories coming out about, restocking inventory levels for some of these larger retailers, then we could definitely see, pressure be applied, especially on the West Coast. But as we know, if pressure is applied to the West Coast, it usually starts to have a domino effect across the entire country.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's going to be a long game, and I think we'll actually start to see a lot of those issues start to surface, maybe even towards the end of Q2, but certainly before we hit that second half of the year mark. Are you thinking it's going to net out the same, or if we could take the crystal ball out, what do you think?
I still think we're going to see the issues could start before the second half of the year, which could start applying pressure on the spot market. I just don't think we're going to see an overall market turn into the carrier's favor until the second half of the year, although I think it's going to be very early second half of the year. But it's going to really be how fast can we squeeze the gap between contract and spot rates. There's just a lot of room to go. And we would need a strong produce season. We would need this impact on the West Coast to happen, and more capacity to the market, which we are seeing. So, again, that crystal ball doesn't have quite an answer yet for us, but I would say it's starting to get clearer by the week, and it's something that we got to continue to keep an eye on. But this winter weather definitely, shakes the crystal ball yet again to make it a little bit more difficult to see.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to force the market turn much sooner than what I think it's actually going to happen for whatever reason. That said, I think we'll leave you here with next week we'll see you with an all new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. Maze, thank you so much for your insights. Until then, drive safely. Any parting words for you, Maze?
No, again, thank you, Jenny, and to all the drivers out there. It's going to be a tough week with the weather. Drive safely, and for anyone that works the shippers and receivers, just understand it's difficult travel times. There's disruptions in the flow of transportation, and anticipate for lateness.
There you go. You heard it here. We'll see you next week.
See you, Jenny.